The bullet that tore through Matthew Ashford's side in the spring of 1872 should have killed him, but instead it sent him tumbling off his horse into a ravine 3 miles outside Bandera, Texas, where the scrub brush and limestone rocks swallowed him whole. Matthew had been riding fence lines on his modest cattle ranch when 3 men emerged from the mesquite thicket, their faces covered with bandanas and their intentions clear. He had reached for his rifle, but the shot came before he could clear the scabbard. The impact threw him sideways, and his mare reared in panic, sending him over the edge of the rocky slope. He remembered the sensation of falling, the sky spinning above him, and then the jarring collision with earth and stone that drove the remaining air from his lungs. After that, there was only darkness and the distant sound of hoofbeats fading into silence. He drifted in and out of consciousness for what might have been hours or days. Sometimes he felt the burning sun on his face, and other times the cool relief of shade. Pain radiated from his side in waves that made him want to scream, but his throat was too dry to make any sound. He knew he was dying. Men did not survive wounds like this alone in the wilderness, bleeding into the Texas dirt while the buzzards circled overhead. But then there were hands on him, gentle but certain, and a voice speaking words he could not understand. The language was foreign to his ears, melodic and soft, completely unlike the rough English and Spanish he was accustomed to hearing in town. He tried to open his eyes, but the sun was too bright, and the effort required more strength than he possessed. He felt himself being moved, felt the agony of his wound protesting the motion, and then he slipped away again into the merciful dark. When Matthew finally surfaced back to consciousness with any clarity, he found himself lying on soft hides in the dim interior of a wickiup. The structure was unfamiliar to him, though he had heard descriptions of Apache dwellings from other ranchers. Sunlight filtered through the brush covering, creating patterns on the curved walls. He turned his head slowly, and that simple movement sent a spike of pain through his torso that made him gasp. The sound brought her to his side immediately. She was young, perhaps 20 or 21 years old, with long black hair that fell past her shoulders and dark eyes that studied him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. She wore a deerskin dress decorated with small shells and beads, and her movements were graceful as she knelt beside him. She spoke again in that melodic language, and when he did not respond, she switched to halting Spanish. "You must not move," she said, her accent heavy but her meaning clear. "The wound is bad. You need rest." Matthew tried to speak, but his throat was parched. She seemed to understand and lifted a gourd of water to his lips. He drank greedily, and she pulled it away before he could make himself sick. The water was cool and tasted faintly of minerals, and it was the most wonderful thing he had ever experienced. "Where am I?" He managed to croak out in Spanish, his own accent marking him as an Anglo who had learned the language from vaqueros and merchants. "You are safe," she replied. "I found you in the ravine. You had been shot. I brought you here. How long? 3 days. You have been sleeping and fevered. I thought you might die, but the fever broke this morning." She touched his forehead with the back of her hand, a gesture so tender that it surprised him. "You are still warm, but better." Matthew tried to process this information. 3 days. The men who had shot him were long gone, and his cattle were probably scattered. His ranch hands would be wondering where he was, though he lived alone and did not always return every night. Someone might have started looking for him by now, but they would have no idea where to search. "My name is Matthew," he said. "Matthew Ashford. I own a ranch near Bandera," she nodded. "I am Naira Kaywaykla. My people are camped in these hills. We move with the seasons." He knew what that meant. The Apache in this region lived on the edges now, displaced from their traditional lands, hunted by the army and by settlers who saw them as threats. The fact that she had helped him rather than leaving him to die spoke to a kindness that transcended the bitter divisions between their peoples. "Why did you help me?" he asked. Naira was quiet for a moment and her expression grew distant. "My brother was wounded last year. White men found him and left him to die. I could not save him. Perhaps I could not save you either, but I had to try. A life is a life." The simple truth of her words struck Matthew deeply. He had lived in Texas for 8 years, having come west from Missouri after the war, and he had absorbed the prejudices and fears of his neighbors without much thought. The Apache were to be avoided, to be feared, to be driven away. But here was a woman who had risked herself to save a stranger, who had tended his wounds and kept him alive through fever and pain. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it with his whole heart. "You saved my life." She ducked her head and he thought he saw the faintest hint of a smile. "Rest now. You need to heal." Over the following days, Matthew learned what it meant to be cared for by Naira. She changed his bandages twice daily, applying poultices made from plants he did not recognize. The mixture smelled bitter and stung when she pressed it to his wound, but he could feel that it was working. The angry red inflammation around the injury began to fade, and the pain became more manageable. She brought him broth made from rabbit and wild onions, and later, when he could stomach more, she fed him roasted meat and a kind of flatbread cooked on hot stones. She spoke little at first, focusing on her tasks with quiet efficiency. But as the days passed and Matthew grew stronger, she began to talk more freely. She told him about her people, about the old ways that were fading as the world changed around them. Her band was small, only 30 people, led by her uncle. They moved frequently to avoid both the army and hostile settlers, hunting and gathering as they had for generations, though the land that had once sustained them was growing smaller every year. "We do not want war," she said one evening as she sat near the fire, grinding corn in a stone metate. "But the soldiers come and the ranchers come and they say we are trespassing on our own land. My father died fighting for a place to live. My brother died running from men who would have killed him for sport. I am tired of death." Matthew listened, propped up on the hides that served as his bed. He was still too weak to stand for more than a few minutes, but the infection had cleared and his body was beginning to repair itself. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not know, I knew things were difficult, but I never thought about what it meant, what it really meant." Naira looked at him across the fire, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. "Most people do not think, they only fear. Fear makes them cruel. You had every reason to fear me, to leave me where you found me, but you did not. Fear and hate make us smaller," she said. "My grandmother taught me that. She said that every person we help makes the world a little larger, a little brighter. I try to remember that, even when it is hard." Matthew felt something shift inside him, some old certainty crumbling away. He had built his life on assumptions about how the world worked, about who was good and who was dangerous. And this woman was quietly dismantling all of it with her kindness and her wisdom. 2 weeks after he had first awakened in the wickiup, Matthew was able to stand and walk short distances. Naira accompanied him on slow circuits around the camp, steadying him when he stumbled and encouraging him when he grew frustrated with his weakness. The other members of her band watched them with guarded expressions, and Matthew understood their wariness. He was an outsider, a white man, and his presence put them at risk. If soldiers came, if anyone discovered that they had sheltered him, there could be terrible consequences. Naira's uncle, a weathered man named Kaywaykla who carried himself with quiet authority, spoke to Matthew one afternoon in careful English. "You are healing," he said. "It was not quite a question." "Yes, thanks to your niece. I owe her my life." Kaywaykla nodded slowly. She has a good heart. Too good sometimes, but you must leave soon. It is not safe for you here, and your presence is not safe for us. Matthew understood. I will go as soon as I am strong enough. I would not bring trouble to your people after you have shown me such kindness. Where will you go? Back to my ranch if it is still there. Back to my life. Even as he said the words, they felt hollow. How could he simply return to his old existence after everything he had experienced, after everything Naira had taught him? That evening, as Naira brought him his meal, he told her what her uncle had said. She nodded, her expression carefully neutral. He is right. You need to return to your home, and we need to move on. We stay too long in one place and people begin to notice. Will I see you again? The question came out before Matthew could stop himself, and he heard the naked longing in his own voice. Naira looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something in her eyes that matched what he was feeling. It was impossible, and they both knew it. He was a rancher, a white man trying to build a life in Texas. She was Apache, part of a people who were being pushed to the margins of survival. There was no future in which they could be together, no path that made sense. I do not know, she said finally. The world is not kind to people like us. People like us, people who see past the walls that others build, people who refuse to hate just because it is easier. She set down the wooden bowl she was holding and reached out to touch his hand, just briefly. Her fingers were warm against his skin. I am glad I found you, Matthew Ashford. I am glad you lived. I am glad too, he said. More than I can say. 2 days later, Matthew was ready to leave. His wound was healing cleanly, and though he was still weaker than he liked, he could walk for hours without tiring. Naira had given him food for the journey and had helped him fashion a walking stick from a straight branch of oak. She walked with him to the edge of the camp, and the rest of her people watched silently as they said their farewells. Follow the creek south for 3 miles, she told him. Then turn west toward the setting sun. You will reach Bandera by tomorrow evening if you walk steadily. Thank you, Matthew said, for everything. I will never forget what you did for me. Naira smiled, and it transformed her serious face into something radiant. Be safe, Matthew. Live well. He wanted to say more, wanted to find the words to express the depth of what he was feeling, but they caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded and turned to follow the creek. He walked for several minutes before he allowed himself to look back, but when he did, Naira was gone, and the camp had already begun to disappear into the landscape as her people prepared to move on. The walk back to Bandera was long and exhausting, but Matthew made it by the following evening, just as Naira had predicted. His ranch hands greeted him with a mixture of relief and astonishment, and they bombarded him with questions about where he had been and what had happened. He told them he had been shot and had crawled into a ravine to hide, that he had survived on water from the creek and his own stubbornness. He did not mention Naira or her people. Some instinct told him that to speak of them would be to put them in danger, and he could not do that after everything they had given him. His ranch was more or less intact, though some cattle had wandered and would need to be rounded up. The men who had shot him had not bothered to raid his property, apparently satisfied with having eliminated him as they had intended. Matthew hired an additional hand and set about repairing the damage and rebuilding his herd. He threw himself into the work with single-minded determination, trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythms of ranch life. But at night, when the work was done and he lay in his bed listening to the coyotes howl in the distance, he thought of Naira. He wondered where she was, whether her people had found a safe place to camp, whether she ever thought of him. The memory of her gentle hands and her quiet strength haunted him, and he began to realize that something fundamental had changed inside him during those weeks in the wickiup. Summer gave way to autumn, and Matthew continued to work his ranch. He made the trip into Bandera every week for supplies, and he listened carefully to the talk in the general store and the saloon. There were rumors of Apache sightings in the hills, and some of the ranchers were talking about organizing a hunting party to drive them out. Matthew felt his stomach turn at the casual way they discussed it, as though they were talking about clearing out a nest of rats rather than human beings with lives and families. "Those savages need to be taught a lesson," one man said, spitting tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "They have got no business on our land." Matthew bit his tongue, knowing that any defense he offered would only draw suspicion on himself. But the anger burned in his chest, and he left the saloon without finishing his drink. He began to ride out into the hills on his days off, ostensibly to check for strays, but really to look for any sign of Naira and her people. He never found their camp, though he sometimes saw tracks that might have been theirs. The Apache were experts at concealing their movements, and he was just a rancher with limited tracking skills. Still, he kept looking, driven by a need he could not fully articulate even to himself. It was late October when he finally saw her again. He had ridden up to the high pastures to move some cattle and had stopped to water his horse at a spring. She emerged from the trees like a ghost, and for a moment he thought his loneliness had conjured her from memory. But then she spoke, and her voice was real and warm and achingly familiar. "Hello, Matthew Ashford." He dismounted so quickly he nearly fell, his legs unsteady beneath him. "Naira, I have been looking for you. I have been hoping." She came closer, and he could see that she looked thinner than she had before, her cheekbones more pronounced. The summer had been hard on her people, he realized, harder than usual. "Why were you looking for me?" she asked, though he thought he heard hope in her question. "Because I could not stop thinking about you. Because you changed something in me, and I did not want to go back to the way things were before." He took a breath, steadying himself. "How are you? How is your band?" "We survive," she said. "It grows harder each season. The game is scarce, and the soldiers patrol more frequently. We must be very careful." An idea had been forming in Matthew's mind over the past months, an idea so audacious and complicated that he had barely allowed himself to consider it seriously. But seeing Naira again, seeing the toll that this life was taking on her, crystallized his resolve. "Come with me," he said. "Come to my ranch. I have land, I have resources, I can help you." Naira's eyes widened. "Matthew, that is impossible. Your neighbors would never accept it. They would drive us away or worse." "Not your whole band," he said, though even as he said it, he wished he could offer that too. "You, come with me. I can say you are my housekeeper, my cook. People might talk, but they would not dare to interfere with what I do on my own property. You would do this. Risk everything for someone you barely know." "I know you," Matthew said firmly. "I know your kindness and your courage and your wisdom. I know that I have thought of nothing else but you for the past 5 months. I know that I am in love with you, Naira, and I cannot stand the thought of you struggling out here when I have the means to help." The words hung between them, and Matthew felt his heart pounding in his chest. He had laid everything bare, and now he could only wait for her response. Naira looked at him for a long moment, and he saw emotions flickering across her face too quickly to name. Finally, she said, "My uncle will not like this. My people will not understand. Do you want to come?" That was the only question that mattered. "Yes," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, Matthew, I want to come with you. I have thought of you too every day. I told myself I was foolish, that there could be nothing between us, but I could not make my heart listen." Relief and joy flooded through Matthew so powerfully that he felt dizzy. He stepped forward and took her hands in his, and she did not pull away. "Then it is settled. We will make this work. I promise you, I will keep you safe and happy. That will be my life's work from this day forward." Naira smiled, and he saw tears glinting in her eyes. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Matthew Ashford." "Probably both," he admitted. "But I know this is right. I feel it in my bones." She squeezed his hands. "I need to speak with my uncle. I need to tell my people. This will not be easy for them to accept. I am abandoning them in a way, leaving when they need every person." "You are ensuring your survival," Matthew said. "They will understand that even if it hurts, and perhaps in time I can find ways to help them too. Food, supplies. I cannot solve everything, but I can do something." Naira nodded slowly. "Give me 3 days. Meet me at this spring at dawn in 3 days. I will either be here or I will not." Matthew understood. She was giving herself time to make a final decision, time to say goodbye to the only life she had ever known. It was a fair request, though the thought of waiting 3 more days when he had finally found her again was almost unbearable. "I will be here," he promised. "I will wait as long as it takes." She released his hands and stepped back. For just a moment she reached up and touched his face, her palm resting against his bearded cheek. Then she turned and disappeared back into the trees, moving with the silent grace that her people had perfected over countless generations. The next 3 days were the longest of Matthew's life. He went through the motions of his work, but his mind was elsewhere. He prepared a room in his ranch house for Naira, cleaning and airing it out, adding blankets and a wash basin. He told his ranch hands that he was hiring a housekeeper, a Mexican woman from one of the neighboring settlements. They did not question the story, accustomed as they were to Matthew's occasional eccentricities. On the 3rd morning, Matthew rode out to the spring well before dawn. He arrived in the dark and waited as the sky gradually lightened from black to deep blue to pale gold. Birds began to sing in the trees, and his horse cropped grass contentedly, unconcerned with his rider's anxiety. The sun broke over the hills, flooding the landscape with warm light, and still Naira did not come. Matthew's heart began to sink. She had decided against it. She had chosen to stay with her people, to remain in the life she knew despite its hardships. He could not blame her. What he had offered was uncertain and strange, a leap into an unknown future with a man she barely knew, among people who would hate her for what she was. But then, just as he was preparing to turn his horse around, she appeared. She emerged from the morning shadows carrying a small bundle, everything she owned in the world. She wore the same deerskin dress she had worn when they first met, and her hair was freshly braided. She looked frightened and determined in equal measure. Matthew dismounted and went to her. "You came." "I came," she confirmed. "I spoke with my uncle. He is not happy, but he understands. He said that I must follow my own path and that he could not protect me forever. He gave me his blessing, though it hurt him to do so." "I will honor the trust he has placed in me," Matthew said. "I swear it." Naira nodded, and then she smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face. "Then let us go to your ranch, Matthew Ashford. Let us begin this impossible life we have chosen." Matthew helped her up onto his horse and then swung up behind her. She settled against him, and he wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her. They rode back to the ranch together as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, leaving behind the hills and the hidden places where her people still moved like ghosts through a changing land. The arrival of Naira at Matthew's ranch caused exactly the stir he had expected. His ranch hands stared openly, and though Matthew introduced her as his housekeeper, he could see the doubt and suspicion in their eyes. They recognized her for what she was, and they did not like it. But Matthew paid them well, and they held their tongues, at least to his face. In town, the reaction was worse. Matthew took Naira with him on his weekly supply run, and the looks they received ranged from shock to openly hostile. The storekeeper served them with tight-lipped silence, and several women pulled their children closer as they passed. One man spat deliberately in the street near Naira's feet, and Matthew felt his temper flare hot and dangerous. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. The man looked at him with contempt. "You are making a mistake, Ashford. Bringing that woman into town, into your home, people will not forget it." "I do not care what people forget or remember," Matthew said coldly. "Naira is under my protection. Anyone who troubles her troubles me. Make sure that message gets around." They left Bandera quickly after that, and Matthew could feel Naira trembling beside him on the wagon seat. Back at the ranch, she was quiet as she helped him unload supplies, her face closed off in a way he had not seen before. "I am sorry," he said when they were alone. "I knew it would be difficult, but I did not fully understand how cruel people could be." "I am used to it," Naira said softly. "It is not new, but it hurts nonetheless." Matthew took her hands. "I will make this right. I will show them that you belong here, that you are part of this community whether they like it or not. And in the meantime, you have me. You have this place. You have safety." Naira looked up at him, and he saw the fear and vulnerability she usually kept so carefully hidden. "What if it is not enough? What if we cannot make this work?" "Then we will find another way," Matthew said firmly, "but we will find it together. I did not bring you here to abandon you at the first sign of trouble. I brought you here because I love you, and because I intend to spend my life making you healthy and happy, just as you saved my life when I had nothing." She leaned into him then, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. They stood like that for a long time, taking strength from each other, preparing for the battles they both knew lay ahead. The first months were difficult. Naira worked tirelessly to prove herself, managing the household with quiet efficiency, learning to cook the foods that Matthew and his ranch hands were accustomed to eating, tending a garden that she planted near the house. She was up before dawn and did not rest until well after dark, and Matthew could see that she was driving herself to exhaustion trying to earn her place. "You do not need to work so hard," he told her one evening as he found her mending clothes by lamplight. "You already belong here. You do not have to prove anything." "I have to prove it to myself," Naira replied. "I have to know that I made the right choice, that I can build a life here." Matthew understood. She had given up everything she knew, everyone she loved, to be with him. The weight of that sacrifice pressed on both of them. He began to find small ways to make her life easier and happier. He brought her seeds from town for plants she had mentioned from her childhood, plants that grew in the hills and had special meaning to her people. He commissioned a woman in Bandera to make her new dresses, though Naira insisted on keeping her deerskin dress as well, wearing it when she was at home. He taught her to read English, spending evenings with books and patience, and her quick mind absorbed the lessons eagerly. Slowly, grudgingly, the ranch hands began to accept her presence. They saw how hard she worked, how she cared for Matthew, how she never complained even when the work was backbreaking and thankless. One of them, a young cowboy named Samuel, began to nod to her politely when their paths crossed. Another, an older man called Pete, accepted the lunch she packed for him with a quiet thank you. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was a start. Winter came, and with it a new set of challenges. The cold was bitter, and Naira had few warm clothes. Matthew bought her a heavy coat and thick gloves, and he made sure the house was well stocked with firewood. They spent the long evenings together, talking by the fire, and Matthew felt his love for her growing deeper with every passing day. It was on a snowy night in January that Matthew finally asked the question that had been burning in his heart for months. They were sitting together on the settle, Naira's head resting on his shoulder when he said, "Marry me, Naira. Be my wife, not just in fact but in name. Let me make this official and permanent." Naira lifted her head, surprise clear in her eyes. "Matthew, we cannot marry. The law does not allow it in many places. And even if we could, it would only make things harder. People already hate that I am here." "I do not care about any of that," Matthew said. "I care about you. I care about us. We will find a way to make it legal, and if we cannot, then we will marry in our hearts and before God. But I want you to be my wife, Naira. I want to build a future with you, a real future." Tears spilled down Naira's cheeks, and Matthew reached up to brush them away gently. "Are you certain?" she whispered. "Are you certain you want to bind yourself to me with all the trouble it will bring?" "I have never been more certain of anything," Matthew said. "You are my life now. You are my future. Everything else is just noise." Naira took a shaky breath, and then she smiled through her tears. "Then yes, Matthew Ashford, yes, I will marry you. I will be your wife and stand beside you no matter what comes." Matthew kissed her then, a tender kiss full of promise and hope. When they finally drew apart, both of them were crying, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were choosing. They married quietly in the spring of 1873, in a ceremony performed by a sympathetic circuit preacher who came through Bandera once a month. The preacher had fought in the war and had seen enough suffering to believe that love should be celebrated wherever it was found, regardless of circumstance. He married them in the ranch house with only Pete and Samuel as witnesses, and he recorded the marriage in his book with a firm hand. "You two have chosen a hard path," the preacher said when it was done. "But I believe it is the right one. Love is rare and precious, and it should be honored. God bless you both." Matthew paid him generously and shook his hand with gratitude. That night, he and Naira celebrated their marriage with a simple meal and a quiet joy that needed no witness beyond themselves. She wore a new dress of pale blue calico that Matthew had bought for the occasion, and he had shaved and put on his best shirt. They were awkward and tender with each other, two people learning what it meant to be husband and wife, and when they finally retired to their bedroom, it was with a sense of stepping into a new world together. The marriage changed something in Naira. She carried herself with more confidence, secure in her place at Matthew's side. She began to speak up more, to offer her opinions and suggestions about the ranch. Matthew listened, and often her insights were valuable. She had a different way of seeing the land, an understanding born from generations of living in harmony with it rather than trying to dominate it. She showed him which plants could provide medicine, which areas were best for grazing at different times of year, how to read the weather signs that most ranchers missed. The ranch prospered under their combined stewardship. Matthew's herd grew, and he was able to hire more hands and expand his operations. He made sure to pay fair wages and to treat his workers with respect, and in return, he earned their loyalty. Slowly, the fact of his Apache wife became just another aspect of the Ashford Ranch, something noted but not actively opposed by most people. There were still incidents, of course. Men in town who muttered insults under their breath, women who refused to speak to Naira, children who threw stones and ran away. Each incident hurt, and Matthew dealt with them as firmly as he could without making things worse. He stopped going to church because the preacher there delivered a sermon about the evils of mixing races that left him so furious he could not see straight. He took his business to merchants who were willing to be civil to his wife, and he avoided the ones who were not. But there were bright spots too. A Mexican family that ran a small farm on the outskirts of town befriended Naira, recognizing in her something of their own struggles to belong in a place that did not always want them. The wife, Maria, taught Naira how to make tortillas and tamales, and Naira taught Maria about the medicinal plants that grew in the hills. The friendship was a lifeline for Naira, a reminder that she was not entirely alone. Summer came, and with it a drought that tested every rancher in the region. Water sources dried up, and cattle began to die. Matthew watched his herd dwindle with growing concern, knowing that if the drought continued, he could lose everything he had built. But Naira knew where to find hidden springs in the hills, places her people had used for generations. She led Matthew to them, and he was able to water his cattle and save much of his herd while his neighbors suffered devastating losses. Word of Matthew's success spread, and other ranchers began to ask him how he had managed. He told them the truth, that his wife had shown him where to find water, and some of them looked at Naira with new respect. It was not acceptance, not exactly, but it was acknowledgement that she had value, that her knowledge was worth something. It was a small victory, but Matthew treasured it nonetheless. In the fall of 1873, Naira fell ill. It started as a cough that would not go away, and then she developed a fever that left her weak and shaking. Matthew was frantic, remembering his own brush with death and how Naira had saved him. Now it was his turn to save her, and he threw himself into the task with desperate determination. He rode to Bandera and brought back the town doctor, a gruff man named Harding who examined Naira with professional detachment. "Pneumonia," he pronounced. "She needs rest and warmth. Keep her hydrated. I will leave you some medicine that might help, but mainly she needs time." Matthew paid the doctor, and then set about nursing Naira with the same devotion she had shown him. He kept the fire burning day and night, wrapped her in every blanket he owned, and made her drink water and broth even when she protested weakly that she could not. He slept in a chair beside her bed, so he could tend to her if she needed anything during the night. His ranch hands took over the running of the property without complaint, recognizing that Matthew's place was at his wife's side. The fever lasted for a week, and there were moments when Matthew thought he would lose her. She called out in her sleep in her native language, words he could not understand but that sounded like prayers or pleas. He held her hand and talked to her in a steady voice, telling her stories about their future, about the life they would build together when she was well. "We are going to have a house full of children," he told her on the 6th night, when her fever was at its highest and her breathing was labored. "At least 3, maybe more. They are going to have your eyes and your intelligence and your kindness. They are going to grow up knowing both of their heritages, proud of where they come from, and you are going to teach them everything you know, all the wisdom of your people. But you have to fight, Naira. You have to come back to me." Whether she heard him or not, he could not say. But the next morning her fever broke. She opened her eyes clear and aware for the first time in days, and she saw Matthew slumped in the chair beside her, exhausted from his vigil. "Matthew," she said, her voice hoarse but unmistakably her own. He jerked awake, and when he saw that she was truly conscious, truly present, he felt tears of relief streaming down his face. Thank God, Naira, I thought I was going to lose you." "I heard you," she said softly. "When I was lost in the fever, I heard your voice. You brought me back." "You saved my life once," Matthew said, taking her hand and pressing it to his lips. "I could not let you go without fighting just as hard as you fought for me. That is what we do. We save each other." Naira smiled weakly. 3 children, at least." "At least," Matthew confirmed, and he laughed through his tears. "If you are willing." "I am willing," Naira said. "I want to build that future with you, Matthew. I want all of it." Naira's recovery was slow but steady. Matthew continued to care for her with unwavering dedication, and as her strength returned, so did her spirits. By the time winter set in, she was back on her feet and resuming her work around the ranch, though Matthew insisted she take things more slowly than before. "You do not need to prove anything anymore," he reminded her gently. "You are my wife. This is your home. Let me take care of you." "Taking care of each other is not the same as one person doing everything," Naira countered. "I want to contribute. I want to be your partner, not just someone you care for." Matthew understood, and he found ways to include her in decisions about the ranch while still making sure she did not overtax herself. They made a good team, complementing each other's strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. In the spring of 1874, Naira discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. Matthew worried about her health, remembering how sick she had been just months earlier. Naira worried about bringing a child into a world that might not accept them, a child who would be caught between two worlds just as she now was. But beneath the worry was profound happiness. This baby was a symbol of their love, proof that something beautiful could emerge from the unlikely union between them. Matthew became even more protective as Naira's pregnancy progressed. He insisted she rest frequently, prepared special foods to keep her strength up, and hovered over her with anxious attention. Naira bore his fussing with patient amusement, though she also made sure to remind him regularly that pregnancy was not an illness, and that women had been giving birth since the dawn of time. "I am stronger than you think," she told him one evening as they sat together watching the sunset. "I come from a line of strong women. My grandmother gave birth to my mother while fleeing from soldiers. My mother had 4 children and never complained once. I will be fine, Matthew." "I know you are strong," Matthew said, "but I cannot help worrying. You are everything to me." Naira leaned against him, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. "And you are everything to me. Our baby will be born healthy and strong because they will be loved. That is what matters." The summer passed peacefully, and Matthew found himself preparing for fatherhood with a mixture of excitement and terror. He built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it smooth and carving small designs into the headboard. Naira sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving with practiced skill. They talked about names, about how they would raise their child, about the values they wanted to instill. "I want our children to know both worlds," Naira said. "I want them to speak both languages, to understand where they come from. It will not be easy for them being mixed. But if we teach them to be proud, to be strong, maybe they can build bridges that we cannot." "We will teach them," Matthew promised. "And we will protect them as much as we can. They will know they are loved, no matter what anyone else says." In late September, Naira went into labor. Matthew sent one of his ranch hands to fetch Maria, who had promised to help with the delivery. He stayed with Naira, holding her hand and wiping her forehead as the contractions grew stronger and closer together. He had never felt so helpless or so awed. This was something he could not fix or control, something that Naira had to do on her own, though he could be there to support her. Maria arrived and took charge with calm efficiency, shooing Matthew out of the room when Naira's labor intensified. He paced the hallway outside, listening to the sounds from within, and praying to whatever gods might be listening that Naira and the baby would both be safe. It was nearly midnight when he heard the thin, warbling cry of a newborn, and moments later Maria opened the door with a broad smile. "You have a son," she said. "A big, healthy boy, and your wife is fine though tired. Come and meet your child." Matthew entered the room on shaking legs. Naira was propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright with joy. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made, and as Matthew approached, she pulled back the fabric to reveal a red, wrinkled face topped with a shock of black hair. "Our son," she said softly. "Matthew, look at him." Matthew sat on the edge of the bed and gazed down at his child, and he felt his heart expand with a love so vast it threatened to overwhelm him. The baby's eyes were closed, but his tiny hand emerged from the blanket and waved in the air. Matthew extended his finger, and the baby's fingers curled around it with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Matthew said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are amazing, Naira. You did this. You brought him into the world. We brought him into the world," Naira corrected gently. "You and me together. We made him from love." They named their son Michael, a strong name that Matthew's father had carried with the middle name of Nanton, which Naira said meant leader in her language. Michael Nanton Ashford, a child of two worlds, a bridge between peoples. Matthew held his son and made a silent vow to protect him, to give him every opportunity, to make sure he grew up knowing he was loved and valued. The arrival of baby Michael softened some of the hostility that had surrounded Matthew and Naira. There was something about a baby that transcended prejudice, at least for a moment. Women in town who had previously ignored Naira would stop to admire Michael when they came to Bandera for supplies, cooing over his dark eyes and thick hair. It was not acceptance, but it was a thaw in the cold front they had been facing. Matthew and Naira settled into the rhythms of parenthood. Naira proved to be a patient and loving mother, and Matthew was besotted with his son. He carried Michael around the ranch in a sling that Naira had made, showing him the cattle and the horses, talking to him about everything and nothing. The ranch hands teased him good-naturedly about being smitten, but they also treated Michael with kindness, perhaps recognizing that the baby represented hope for a different kind of future. The years began to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Michael grew from a baby into a toddler, bright and curious and fearless. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn determination. Naira taught him words in her language, and Matthew taught him about ranching. They read to him from books, played with him in the yard, and watched with wonder as he began to develop his own personality. In 1876, Naira gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Naira Ashford. Nora was smaller and quieter than Michael had been, with a thoughtful temperament and a watchful gaze. She seemed to take everything in, processing the world around her with careful attention. Matthew adored her instantly, this tiny girl who fit so perfectly in his arms. The ranch continued to prosper. Matthew had become known as one of the most successful ranchers in the region, and his methods were studied and copied by others. He always credited Naira when people asked for his secret, though many of them did not want to hear it. But some did listen, and slowly, grudgingly, Naira's knowledge and insights gained wider recognition. Matthew had not forgotten his promise to help Naira's people if he could. He made quiet inquiries, and eventually learned that her uncle's band had been forced onto a reservation far to the west. The conditions there were harsh, and many people were suffering. Matthew began sending supplies through intermediaries, using contacts he had developed over the years. He could not solve the larger injustices, but he could ease some small measure of suffering, and that mattered to him and to Naira. One evening in the summer of 1877, as they sat on the porch watching Michael and Nora play in the yard, Naira turned to Matthew and said, "I never imagined I could be this happy. When I was living in the hills, running and hiding, I thought survival was the best I could hope for. But you gave me so much more than survival. You gave me a life, a real life." Matthew took her hand. "You gave me that too. Before I met you, I was just going through the motions. I had a ranch, I had work, but I did not have purpose. You gave me purpose. You gave me love. You gave me a family." "We saved each other," Naira said, echoing the words they had spoken years earlier. "We did," Matthew agreed. "And we will keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was a moment of perfect peace, the kind that comes rarely in life, and they both savored it. The children grew, and the ranch grew with them. In 1879, Naira gave birth to their third child, another son they named Malcolm Thomas Ashford. Malcolm was loud and energetic from the start, filling the house with noise and laughter. With 3 children, the ranch house felt truly alive, full of the chaos and joy that children bring. Matthew expanded the house to accommodate their growing family, adding rooms and a larger kitchen. Naira decorated their home with a blend of influences, incorporating elements from her Apache heritage, alongside the more traditional furnishings Matthew had inherited. The result was unique and beautiful, a physical representation of their blended life. Michael, now 6 years old, began to ask questions about his heritage. He had noticed that he looked different from most of the children in town, and he wanted to know why. Matthew and Naira sat him down and explained, in terms he could understand, about where his mother came from and what that meant for him. "Some people will treat you differently because of who you are," Naira told him gently. "They will say unkind things. But you must remember that you are loved and that you come from strength on both sides of your family. Never be ashamed of who you are." "I am not ashamed," Michael said with the certainty of childhood. "I think it is special. I get to have 2 stories instead of just one." Matthew felt his throat tighten with emotion. His son's simple wisdom cut through all the complexity and fear. 2 stories instead of one. That was exactly right. As the children grew older, Matthew made sure they received good educations. He hired a tutor to come to the ranch several times a week, a young woman from San Antonio who was patient and skilled. Michael, Nora, and eventually Malcolm learned reading, writing, mathematics, and history. Naira supplemented their lessons with teachings from her own culture, stories and skills that had been passed down through generations. The 1880s brought more changes to Texas. The frontier was closing, towns were growing, and the old ways were fading. The last of the free Apache bands were hunted down and forced onto reservations, and Naira grieved for her people even as she was grateful for the life she had built. Matthew held her through her tears and helped her process the complex emotions of survivors' guilt and sorrow. They made a trip to the reservation in 1882, taking the children to meet Naira's uncle and the remnants of her band. It was a difficult journey in many ways, confronting the stark reality of what had been lost and what had been forced upon the Apache people. But it was also important. Naira's uncle, now elderly and frail, met his great-nieces and great-nephew with tears in his eyes. "You did well," he told Naira in their language, which Matthew had learned enough of over the years to understand. "You survived. You built a life. You had children who will carry our blood into the future. That matters." "I feel like I abandoned you," Naira said, her voice breaking. "You saved yourself," her uncle replied. "And in doing so, you saved something of us. These children, they are our future. Teach them well." They left the reservation with heavy hearts, but also with a renewed sense of purpose. Matthew increased his support for Naira's people, sending more supplies and using his growing influence to advocate for better conditions. It was not enough, could never be enough to right the wrongs that had been done, but it was something. Back at the ranch, life continued its steady march forward. Michael grew into a tall, confident young man with a gift for handling horses. Nora developed a love of learning and spent hours reading books from the growing library Matthew had collected. Malcolm was the wild one, always getting into mischief, but with such charm that it was hard to stay angry with him for long. In 1885, Matthew and Naira celebrated their 12th wedding anniversary. Matthew had planned a special evening, sending the children to stay with Maria's family so he and Naira could have time alone. He cooked dinner himself, a rare event that made Naira laugh, and they ate by candlelight like they had on their wedding night. 12 years, Naira said, shaking her head in wonder. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes it feels like a lifetime. It has been a lifetime, Matthew said. The best lifetime I could have imagined. You made me a better man, Naira. You made me see the world differently. I would not change a single day, even the hard ones. Not even the day you were shot, Naira teased gently. Not even that day, Matthew said seriously, because it brought me to you. Everything that followed, all the love and the family and the life we built, it started with that day. So no, I would not change it. Naira reached across the table and took his hand. I love you, Matthew Ashford. I loved you when you were a wounded stranger in my wickiup. I loved you when you asked me to come to your ranch. I loved you on our wedding day. And I love you now more than ever, because you have spent every day of our marriage making me healthy and happy, just as you promised. And you have spent every day making me whole, Matthew replied. We are partners in the truest sense. We are two halves of one story. They kissed across the table, and then Matthew led her outside to the porch where they could watch the stars come out. They sat together in the swing he had built, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm night, and talked about everything and nothing until the moon rose high and bright. The years continued to pass, bringing both triumphs and trials. Michael fell in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a strong-willed young woman named Sarah who did not care about his mixed heritage. They married in 1890, and Matthew and Naira gained a daughter-in-law who fit seamlessly into their family. Within a year, Sarah gave birth to Matthew and Naira's first grandchild, a girl they named Emily. Holding his granddaughter for the first time, Matthew felt the circle of life completing itself in a profound way. This child carried his blood and Naira's blood, Michael's blood and Sarah's blood. She was a testament to what was possible when people chose love over hate, connection over division. Nora proved to be a gifted teacher and began working with children in Bandera, many of them from families who had once shunned her mother. Her patience and skill won over even the most skeptical parents, and she became respected in her own right. She never married, preferring to focus on her work and her family, and Matthew and Naira supported her choices without question. Malcolm took a different path, joining a cattle drive north to Montana and eventually establishing his own small ranch there. He wrote letters home regularly, full of stories about his adventures and the harsh beauty of the Northern Territories. Matthew missed him but was proud of his son's independence and courage. In 1895, Naira fell ill again, this time with a pain in her stomach that would not go away. The doctor in Bandera, a younger man who had replaced the now retired Dr. Harding, was grave after examining her. I believe it is a tumor, he said. There is not much I can do. Keep her comfortable and let her rest. Matthew refused to accept this verdict. He took Naira to San Antonio to see specialists, spent enormous sums on treatments and medicines, and researched every possible option. Naira bore it all with patience, though she told him more than once that she was not afraid of death. I have lived a full life, she said one evening as they sat in their bedroom, her hand in his. I have loved and been loved. I have had children and seen my grandchildren. I have been happy, Matthew. Not everyone can say that. If it is my time, I am ready. I am not ready, Matthew said fiercely. I cannot lose you, Naira. You are my heart. Then you must carry my heart with you when I am gone, Naira said gently. You must keep living, keep loving our children and grandchildren. Promise me you will not shut down if I leave first. Matthew could not promise that, not then. But as the weeks passed and Naira's condition stabilized rather than worsened, he allowed himself to hope. The tumor was still there, but it seemed to be growing slowly if at all. The specialist in San Antonio prescribed pain medicine and a careful diet, and Naira followed the instructions meticulously. Months turned into years, and Naira continued to live, defying the doctor's grim prognosis. She had good days and bad days, but she was still there, still present, still the center of their family. Matthew devoted himself to her care with the same dedication she had once shown him, anticipating her needs, making sure she was comfortable, spending hours simply sitting with her and talking about their life together. "You are keeping me alive," she told him one afternoon in 1897 as they sat in the garden she had planted years earlier. "Your love is stronger than any medicine." "We keep each other alive," Matthew corrected. "That has always been our way." Michael's family grew, with 2 more children arriving in quick succession. Nora adopted a young Apache girl whose parents had died, giving the child a home and a future. Malcolm married a woman he met in Montana and started his own family there. The Ashford clan was expanding, spreading across the West, carrying forward the legacy that Matthew and Naira had begun. In the spring of 1900, as a new century dawned, Matthew and Naira celebrated their 27th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 50s now, their hair gray and their bodies showing the wear of hard years, but their love was as strong as ever. They held a large gathering at the ranch, with all their children and grandchildren present except for Malcolm's family, who were too far away to travel. As Matthew stood on the porch watching his family laugh and play, he felt Naira come up beside him. She slipped her hand into his and he squeezed it gently. "We did it," she said softly. "We built something that will last." "We did," Matthew agreed. "Against all odds, we made a life together. We created a family, and we loved each other through everything." "Do you remember that day by the spring when you asked me to come with you?" Naira asked. "I remember every detail," Matthew said. "I was so afraid you would say no. I was so afraid I would lose you before I ever really had you." "I was afraid too," Naira admitted. "But I chose courage over fear, and it was the best choice I ever made." Matthew turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "You saved my life that day you found me in the ravine, and then you saved it again every day after just by being you. I told you once that I would spend my life making you healthy and happy, and I meant it. Have I done that? Have I kept my promise?" Naira's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You have kept your promise every single day. You have made me healthier than I ever thought possible. You have made me happier than I ever dreamed I could be. You have loved me without reservation, without shame, without hesitation. You have been my partner, my protector, my best friend, and the love of my life. So yes, Matthew Ashford, you have kept your promise. 1,000 times over." They embraced there on the porch, holding each other as they had so many times over the years, and Matthew felt a profound sense of completeness wash over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever time they had left together, he knew that they had succeeded in the thing that mattered most. They had loved each other well. Naira lived for another 8 years, far beyond what any doctor had predicted. She saw more grandchildren born, watched her children build successful lives, and remained the heart of the family until the end. When she finally passed away peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1908, with Matthew holding her hand, she was 60 years old and had lived a life that had defied all expectations. Matthew grieved deeply, as was natural for a man who had lost his life's partner. But he did not shut down as Naira had once feared he might. Instead, he honored her memory by continuing to live fully, by loving their children and grandchildren, by maintaining the ranch they had built together. and by telling anyone who would listen about the remarkable Apache woman who had saved his life, and then spent her own life being his partner in every sense of the word. He lived to be 73 years old, passing away in 1915 with his children gathered around him. His last words were of Naira, calling her name and saying he would see her soon. They buried him next to her on a hill overlooking the ranch, with headstones that bore simple inscriptions. Hers read, Naira Kaywaykla Ashford, beloved wife and mother, 1848–1908. His read, Matthew Ashford, devoted husband and father, 1842–1915. But the real testament to their lives was not carved in stone. It was carried forward in the hearts and lives of their descendants, who spread across the West and beyond, carrying the legacy of two people who had chosen love over fear, courage over hatred, and partnership over isolation. They had proven that even in the hardest of times, in a world divided by prejudice and violence, love could not only survive but thrive. Michael inherited the ranch and ran it successfully for another 30 years, always making sure to tell his own children and grandchildren about how their grandfather had been saved by their Apache grandmother, and how the two of them had built something beautiful and lasting from that first act of kindness. Naira continued her teaching work and became known throughout Texas as an advocate for education for all children, regardless of their background. Malcolm's ranch in Montana prospered, and his children grew up with a deep respect for their mixed heritage. The story of Matthew and Naira became a family legend, passed down through generations. It was told at gatherings and written in letters, embellished in some ways but always true at its core. It was the story of two people from different worlds who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, who fought to build a life together despite everything arrayed against them, and who loved each other with a devotion that transcended all barriers. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the struggles or the prejudice they had faced, not the hardships or the obstacles, but the simple, profound truth that they had loved each other well. Naira had nursed Matthew back to health when he was wounded and dying, giving him back his life. And Matthew had spent the rest of his life making sure that Naira was healthy and happy, protecting her, cherishing her, and building a future with her that honored both of their heritages. They had saved each other in every way that mattered, and in doing so, they had created something that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. Their love story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even when the world seems determined to keep people apart, love can find a way. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations as a testament to what is possible when two hearts choose to beat as one. And so the years rolled on, and the family grew, and the ranch prospered, and the memory of Matthew and Naira remained alive in the hearts of all who came after them. They had lived and loved in the Wild West, in a time of violence and change, and they had proven that the greatest adventure of all was simply choosing to love with your whole heart, regardless of the cost. Their story was one of healing and devotion, of two people who had saved each other, and then spent their lives making sure that salvation was complete. It was a love story for the ages, born in a ravine outside Bandera, Texas, in the spring of 1872, and lasting until the end of their days and beyond.